LeeRoy Yarbrough was a rising star in NASCAR in the later 1960s. He was winning races, cashing $10,000 checks every weekend, and was one of the faces of the sport. Not to mention, he was 15 years younger than most of his peers. He seemed to have it all. He was living the dream. But that all changed after a series of crashes in 1970 and 1971. LeeRoy wasn't the same after these crashes. His mental state declined, he went to rehab, and his behavior was incredibly erratic. This resulted in an incident so horrifying that he spent the remainder of his life in a mental institution. This is the story of LeeRoy Yarbrough and how a couple of crashes derailed his life forever. Lonnie LeeRoy Yarbrough was born in Jacksonville, Florida on September 17, 1938. He grew up on the west side of Jacksonville in a family of 8. He was the firstborn son and named after his father. As a boy, LeeRoy helped with his father's small business, a roadside vegetable stand. He would haul vegetables in an old truck back to the stand. He spent time at a family friend's garage and learned to work on cars. When he was just 12, he built his first car and quickly became a familiar face to the local police officers. He drove a '34 Ford Coupe with a Chrysler engine all across the back roads of West Jacksonville, undoubtedly picking up some skill along the way. At the age of 16, he decided to drop out of high school and race at the local Jacksonville Speedway. He won the first race he competed in. The Jacksonville crowd could point him out at any time on track, as he was known for being able to carry more speed into turn 3 than any other driver. He would perform a signature move, in which he would slide under a car that was ahead of him, carry more speed than them through the corner, and accelerate fast enough to be ahead by the straightaway. This was essentially what we know now as a slide job. Julian Klein was the Jacksonville race promoter and decided to take a chance on him, setting LeeRoy up with competitive rides in national touring, sportsman, and modified races over the next few years. They won about 100 races together in this span. In 1962, LeeRoy won the famous Modified Sportsman 250 at Daytona, his first real big boy win. He went on to win 37 more sportsman races that year. At this time, he started entering a car in the Grand National Series, but didn't have a whole lot of success. However, he was just 23 years old. Most racers at this time were in their 40s or 50s, and young drivers were considered to be 30 or 35 years old. Being just 23, he was destined to be a star. He picked up a pair of short track victories in 1964, beating the likes of Richard Petty, Marvin Panch, David Pearson, Ned Jarrett, Buddy Baker, and others. In addition to the wins, he was finishing in the top 5 nearly every race he made it to the finish. He didn't have the funding to travel nationwide and compete in most of the races over the next few seasons. However, he did race stints for John Thorne, Bud Moore, and Junior Johnson. Over 3 years, he only competed in 36 races, but picked up 2 wins and had several other good runs. Yarbrough got his big break in 1968 when he raced more than 20 events with Junior Johnson and racked up a pair of wins, 6 poles, and 15 top 5s. The next year was even better as he collected 7 victories. Not to mention, he was the first person in NASCAR history to win the Triple Crown, the Daytona 500, the Rebel 400 at Darlington, and the World 600 at Charlotte. He won each race in pretty dramatic fashion, including a last lap pass on Charlie Glotzback. He had dominating wins at Rockingham and the World 600 by lapping the entire field on both occasions. The December 1969 issue of Hot Rod cited that he won the most number of superspeedway races in a year, and more importantly, had the most money earned by a NASCAR driver ever in a NASCAR season. More than $165,000. There was something different about Yarbrough's year. Yarbrough and Junior Johnson didn't bother showing up for the races at local dirt tracks or fairgrounds. They just didn't care. While Pearson and Petty were battling for wins at these small tracks, Junior Johnson and his team were prepping for the big races. When it was all said and done, Yarbrough had no chance to win the championship. He only entered 30 of the 52 races, while dozens of other drivers competed in 40 or more. In his off weeks, Yarbrough helped foot the bill for Johnson's employee salaries by participating in Goodyear tire tests. As a trade, Johnson paid him handsomely to run the tests. Between his couple of IndyCar starts, NASCAR earnings, and tire test checks, LeeRoy collected more than $200,000 in 1969. In addition for being paid for the tests, he actually enjoyed them. He liked the thought of showing up to work for one day, getting to drive a car really fast, and then going home. 1971 started off slow and changed dramatically on April 22nd. Participating in one of his routine tests at Texas World Speedway, LeeRoy suffered a terrible crash. He blew a tire between turns 3 and 4 and hit the wall at 175 miles per hour. I was unconscious for about an hour, but I feel okay today. I hit the wall so hard I cracked my helmet. As tightly as I was strapped in the seat, it's hard for me to believe that my body moved that much. The straps made my shoulders black and blue, and I'm pretty sore. But I'm glad the wall was there. If it had been a fence or rail, I'd probably sailed right through it and turned end over end with much more serious consequences. Despite telling sports writer Bob Myers he was okay, LeeRoy was actually not. He was released from the hospital that same day and was cleared to race that weekend. Kel Yarbrough picked him up from the hospital and took him to the track. Later, LeeRoy had no memory of the crash, the hospital, or Kel picking him up. This should have been the first warning sign that something was terribly wrong. However, he continued as normal, until just a year later. His performance had dipped across the board, but he was pursuing a new goal, a career in open wheel. He ran well in the first few starts he had made, but he was the victim of another huge crash in practice for the 1971 Indy 500. This crash was much worse. Kel Yarbrough recalled, "I was there at the infield hospital after they brought LeeRoy in. He was burned on the hands and neck, and he was woozy from another lick on the head. He was the palest live man I've ever seen. I knew LeeRoy had been scared almost to death, with good reason, and I had this awful gut feeling he'd never do much good racing again." Kel was right, but he couldn't have seen the disastrous ending for LeeRoy on the horizon. After a handful of races in 1972, he essentially fell out of the racing world. Over the next few months, he was in and out of the hospital for different memory challenges and odd reasons. It was published that he contracted Rocky Mountain spotted fever from a tick, but this was never 100% confirmed. Additionally, it was heavily rumored that he became addicted to alcohol and morphine he had received for pain management. Once again, this is not 100% confirmed. Over the next few years, his life fell apart. He lost his big house on the lake. He lost his plane, his boat, and his fancy cars. He and his wife split abruptly, and his 2 children were taken out of his care and placed with another family. A former rival, Tiny Lund, allowed LeeRoy to live with him for a time before a court in 1977 ruled him incompetent to handle his own affairs. He was appointed to move back to his mother's house. At this point, the man who made more than $200,000 in a single year just 8 years prior was reduced to collecting empty bottles on the side of the street in exchange for bottle deposits. He would exchange each bottle for just pennies to make money to buy more alcohol. By 1980, his mother, Minnie, noticed his behavior to worsen even further. He rarely came out of his room, watching TV and reading racing magazines. On February 9, 1980, he was taken to a local hospital by police, in which they released him, stating he only had a drinking problem. His mother told them, "Please keep him there. You don't know LeeRoy. I know my son. He needs help, and it's not the drinking. but they released him. Just 4 days later, LeeRoy accused Minnie of cutting his mouth after dinner. Minnie thought this was strange, but LeeRoy became enraged. "Mama, look how you've cut my mouth." I said, "Son, I haven't done anything to your mouth. Your mouth is all right." LeeRoy opened his mouth. I looked at it. It was not cut. He went back to his bedroom while Minnie continued to do the dishes. He returned to the kitchen shortly and chillingly said, "Mama, I'm going to do something, and I don't want to do it. I'm going to kill you." She begged her son to stop as he threw her across the kitchen. He dragged her by the neck from the dining room to the living room. As he was strangling her, Minnie's grandson Terry returned from the local convenience store. He picked up a jar of jelly and hit LeeRoy repeatedly on the head until he let go of her. They called the police immediately, and once the police arrived, LeeRoy struck again. He hit an officer in the face and fought as a team of firefighters finally brought him down. This obviously made national news, and everyone in the racing world was shocked to see LeeRoy arrested for attempted first-degree murder. While in jail, LeeRoy had no idea why he was even there. He called his mother and family and begged to know why, but no one told him. Finally, he saw in a newspaper nearly a month later what was being reported. He didn't believe it and had no memory of the accident. Just days later, he was committed to a state mental institution as the judge ruled that LeeRoy could not differentiate right from wrong. In March of the next year, Junior Johnson helped set up a fund to pay for LeeRoy's expenses as he was transferred to a North Carolina institution. There was some hope that returning to the racing world at arm's length would help things. Many teams offered LeeRoy mechanic jobs after he completed treatment. But unfortunately, no one on the outside world realized how bad things were. While he was in North Carolina, doctors gave him only a 25% chance of ever functioning again in society. After some time, he was transferred back to Florida. On December 6, 1984, LeeRoy had a terrible seizure and fell. He struck his head and was unconscious and barely responsive. The next morning, he passed due to internal bleeding in the brain. He was just 46 years old. Of all of the tragedies and awful events I've covered on the channel, this is perhaps the most heartbreaking of them all. LeeRoy was an outstanding man who always put his team and family first, but too many head injuries piled up. This was in a time when head injuries were not understood like they are today. He was barely in control over the last decade of his life, where he fell victim to addiction, depression, and even worse, his own mind. No matter how bad things got, LeeRoy was always thinking about racing. It was his true life passion that unfortunately took everything from him. He was on top of the world with an amazing family, all of the money he could hope for, and was considering an early retirement when these accidents started to pile up. LeeRoy shouldn't be remembered as some evil man who attempted to kill his own mother, but rather the compassionate, confident personality that was shown throughout most of his life. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys did enjoy and learn something new. If you did, make sure you leave a like and subscribe so you never miss a video. That's it from me. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.